Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Of Goats and Men. Yeah! All right, guys, have fun. All right, we're going to close this season out with the Goat Man of Maryland and how he sprang from the Royal Forest to kick me in the face a few weeks ago, which was really amazing because it immediately made me think of this guy, whom I used to call Baal, but who could really be a satyr representative of Janus, guarding the gateways between worlds that may have existed or could still possibly exist in Baltimore City, and in more specifically, what is today known as Mount Vernon, but was once called Howard's Park, or as I prefer, Howard's Woods, which was owned by the Howard family. And we've really only scratched the surface with the Howard family, but finding this Janus Gateway connection, and thanks again to What the Flock TV, that was really a revelation to me. And so I did my best to map them out on Howard's Woods in the 1792 city plan. Our Goat Man is located here, along this brushy border, right between two trees, which the cartographer was kind enough to put there for us. Is that a coincidence? I don't know, because the Washington Monument would also be located right between these two trees, which is really amazing. We have the Unitarians here, and tying John Pierpont to the Unitarians is really interesting, because Mud City has the Unitarians acting as a beard for a Muslim presence in Baltimore at the time. Because as I've clearly shown, this front bastion on Fort McHenry leads directly to the Kaaba. We have Carol's Basilica, the shrine to Diana, across the street here, and down here we have the presence of the Church of England. Howard's Auditorium will be located off here to the left, right? But there has to be some sort of deep religious significance to this area of Baltimore for all of these churches of these different denominations to be congregating here in this tiny Cathedral Hill neighborhood of Baltimore. It just can't be a coincidence. There has to be a reason for it, because the narrative tells us that these religions don't necessarily play nicely together. And so Mud City is a paradigm where the existence of, for lack of a better word, otherworldly creatures is very possible, because Mud City knows that people like this believed that. Athanasius Kircher and Sir Isaac Newton, president of the Royal Society. And whether it was a belief in ancient anthropomorphic deities or the demons of their own Christian faith, they certainly believed in the supernatural. And I link them because I found this book, Rethinking Scientific Revolution, right? In chapter 11 of that book, 11, the Gateway chapter, right? The Janus Faces of Science in the 17th Century, Athanasius Kircher and Isaac Newton. And so the dude's landlord, right? And Ben Cross over here, they're gateway scientists. Natural philosophers, right? And one very well known, right? And the other not so much. Yet Athanasius Kircher had his hands in so many things that are directly affecting the world today. And I may have to revisit and reframe him, given all that's been put together in Mud City since I first learned about him. And so they believed that elder gods could be roaming the earth today, and these jokers believed it too, considering the way this whole thing is shaking out, right? And so if they believed that a satyr representative of Janus or some other pagan god, whomever it may have been, lived in Howard's Woods, then the presence of a Maryland urban legend about a goat man is very interesting indeed. And so Falcon's Maze for the Maryland Goat Man starts with where most of the sightings take place, and that's in Prince George's County, Maryland, or as it's known here as PG County. And so Prince George's County is located in southern Maryland here. It's not very far from Baltimore at all, and it borders Washington, D.C. And this is interesting because the Most Reverend John Carroll is from PG County, the founder of Georgetown College, nay University, the first archbishop in America and builder of the Baltimore Basilica, right? And it's his land, it's his family's, it's this branch of the Carroll family that donates all of the land that is today Washington, D.C. And that's very interesting to this story and to the story of Mud City in general. Is it a coincidence that his family owned all of this land in Washington, D.C. and what would eventually become some of what would eventually become PG County? And there's a goat man there, and there's a goat man located not far from the Basilica, right? The goat man here in the Basilica, just 2 or 3 blocks away. I don't know. You tell me. But before we move on, there's one other person of interest who comes from PG County among many, many notable people that I want to bring up here just because of how I think he fits into the story, and that's Jim Henson. And to most of my generation, I'm sure it's sacrilege to speak ill of Jim Henson, but he was, or appears to Mud City anyway, as a major player in the educational psyop of the late 20th century. And so it's interesting that someone so critical in normalizing monsters, making them cute and funny and having them teach us stuff, came from a region that has a monster of its own. And I have to wonder how much Jim Henson could have been influenced by stories of the Maryland Goatman. I think that's very interesting, but maybe not as interesting as finding out that at the Maryland Chemical Works, David McKim owned a slave named Alan Henson, another shirker. Right? Could this Alan Henson at one time been the property of the same Henson family that Jim Henson comes from? Could there be a connection between the McKims and all their influence in the useful arts and Jim Henson? I don't know, because I don't have the time to string this out right now, but my fat sense, my apophenia is running wild with this idea. All right, so moving on, PG County, Prince George's County, gets its name not from one of the Georges of Hanover, but from Prince George of Denmark, Queen Anne's husband. And I talked a little bit about them in the Ballopolis episode about Annapolis, right? It was their sickly child that the Duke of Gloucester Boulevard was named after. And PG County is also home to Bladensburg, site of that horrible disaster that led to the sacking of Washington, D.C. No coincidence there. That was just unbelievable. And it's also home to Bowie, where the majority of the Goatman sightings have taken place. Right? And Bowie is a railroad town. And so without getting too deep into its history here, most of what Bowie is today was the original plantation of one Samuel Ogle. And he was 3-time governor of proprietary Maryland, right? So he was tight with the Calvaires. The border dispute with the Penns begins in earnest under his watch, and so it's a little interesting that maybe perhaps the Poes may have made their way here when he was governor as well, right? And so Sammy here, right, he's from Newcastle on Tyne, right? And it's not the first time that Newcastle has come up in this show, not only here in northern England, but also in Delaware as the birthplace of Quaker John. But I'm sure all of this is just a coincidence, right? And so now we have a little background to go on with PG County, just to fit it in a little bit better with the Mud City paradigm and not just as home of the Goatman. And of course, we have the Carrolls. Oh, thank you. And so, of course, we have the Carrolls owning land here, perhaps making Samuel Ogle a very good liaison between the Carrolls and the Calvaires. All right, so now it's time to get to the legend of the Goatman. How did the legend of the Goatman begin? And we're going to start it off by replacing this image of the Goatman with a slightly more menacing one to match the tenor of the legend. Because the Goatman isn't some cute and cuddly fawn prancing around PG County like Mr. Tumnus of Narnia. Oh no, right? Because the Goatman of Maryland is supposed to be terrifying. He's supposed to be an axe-wielding murderer of teenagers, like this guy. And so this is what we're going with for the Goatman from here on out, right? And so according to Dr. Barry Pearson, the folklorist of the University of Maryland, the stories began surfacing a long time ago. The Goatmen have been here the whole time, right? But like every good 20th century urban legend, the Goatman resurfaces in a big way starting in the 1950s and reaching its peak in the 1970s. And so the Goatman, of course, starts out as that classic boomer boogeyman trope, stalking lust-filled teenagers parking on Lover's Lane, and in extreme stories, going so far as to dragging the young lovers out of their cars, killing the boys, and then raping and killing the girls, which is a really sort of brutal element to the story, but mostly the stories have them as just scary and menacing enough to scare the couples away. All right, so now from a cryptozoological perspective, that is, treating the Goatman as if he's real, like they do with Sasquatch, right, and using folklore and mythology as a baseline, then Goatman hanging out on Lover's Lane makes sense, because satyrs were degenerate perverts. And so there are versions of the satyr that date back into Proto-Indo-European times, right? And they're also in the Vedic literature of the Hindus, and they're even in the Old Testament. And by the time the Greeks and Romans get a hold of them, they're primarily connected to our old pal Dionysus. And they're mostly known for being drunken pranksters with permanent erections. And that just could not have been comfortable for the satyrs to, continuing right? Not only do they have these permanent erections, right? They have a insatiable sexual appetite. And they try to get with every nymph, goddess, or human woman that gets too close to them. And so, absolutely, if a creature like this was roaming around the woods, they would be attracted to the pheromones emitted during sexual activity. But for the most part, they're not violent in the mythology. Sure, they may try to rape you, and there are stories of them getting so drunk and crazed that they run into the woods and attack other animals, but by most accounts, it appears that they're very easily fended off. And so the axe-murdering element of our goat man in Maryland here doesn't quite fit, but then there is that other satyr-like goat man, right? Baphomet, right? So maybe that element does fit, just a little bit, I don't know. But by the early 1970s, the legend of the Maryland goat man takes a modern mythological turn when it becomes associated with the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. And so, stealing a page from Stan Lee in Marvel Comics, the legend develops an origin story that reads like a bad Spider-Man villain's origin. When in 1970, a researcher at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center was doing experiments on goats when something went awry, turning him into a hideous creature with the upper body of a goat. So I don't know what this origin does or says about all those earlier stories and sightings of the 50s and 60s, not to mention the stories about the goat man being nothing more than an angry farmer, trying to get the kids off his land, Scooby-Doo style, right? Dressing up as a goat man or whatever, right? But by 1970, he's a lab experiment gone wrong. And so when I first read about the goat man of PG County, I asked the lovely Mrs. Fats, who's from Maryland, if she'd ever heard of him, and she said no, that she hadn't, but that one of her best friends grew up in Bowie, and that I should ask her. And so a few texts later, her friend confirmed that as a little girl in the 1970s and early 1980s, she heard the lab experiment gone wrong story, and that older kids, who were probably stoned, given the era, teased the younger kids with stories about hearing the goat man in the woods, right? He was a boogeyman. And the parents as well, right? If you're not good enough, the goat man's gonna get you. And I'm certain it's a trope that has countless variations across the realm, right? And seeing the goat man story evolve from he was always here to lab experiment gone wrong, I need to take a look at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. But before I do, let's talk just a little bit more about the goat man. Because it's after this 1970 date that the goat man is propelled from local folklore to bona fide urban legend when the Washington Post goes national with a local Prince George's County newspaper story about the goat man killing a little girl's dog, cementing his legend on a national stage. And reports and sightings of the goat man explode during the 1970s. There is allegedly some film footage out there a la the Patterson-Gimli film of Sasquatch, but I couldn't find it. But there is a still photograph of him. Make what you will of this image, and I actually love this image, and I have to wonder how many times it made its way through the Bigfoot circles before it was cast down as a goat man. I don't know. And speaking of Bigfoot, just as Sasquatch is found well outside the Pacific Northwest, there are goat men all over the place. He's in Wisconsin, he's in Pennsylvania, they have stories of the goat man in Texas, and in West Virginia, they're called sheep squatch. But they're out there, right? They're all over the country. Every region has some variation of its own goat man and its own goat man origin story. But most of the origin stories abroad, so to speak, seem to revolve around Satanism and demons mating with goats or people and creating the goat men. And of course, the demons of Satanism are nothing more than the recastings of the ancient anthropomorphic gods that were being worshipped as they were doing here in Baltimore, right? Worshipping anthropomorphic gods like the goat man. If the controllers of Baltimore believed these things were out there, then they would need to keep Gen Pop away from the woods, distancing the general public from whatever perceived power the adepts of this practice believe they had over said public, whom they've conned into accepting the Judeo-Christian narrative as a placeholder for the social control they could engineer with science and technology. And this is what makes the research lab origin for the goat man really stand out, especially considering Baltimore's contributions to the sciences. All right, and so now it's time to take a look at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. And so Beltsville is one of the towns in PG County that neighbors Bowie. And believe me, seeing the Wallace name and knowing its connections to our McKims/Frasers definitely had my fat senses tingling, right? Because I immediately had to find out who the heck Henry A. Wallace was. And so Henry A. Wallace was an American politician, journalist, farmer, and businessman, right, of course, right? And check out the 8s that can be culled from his birth and death dates. I mean, that's just crazy, the amount of 8s that can be pulled from there, right? And crazier still is his career as a politician. Right, so if you want to ask me if he could be of these same Wallaces that go back to the Scottish Crown and our friends the McKims via the Frasers, I think taking a look at some of the offices he held will shed a little light on that for us. He holds offices at the highest peaks of government under FDR and through and after World War II, the war that, for all intents and purposes, created the realm as we know it today, regardless of how the narrative or its revisionists sell it. Right? And so during this most important time in human history, our boy here held offices like the chair of the Supply Priorities and Allocations Board, a 5-month appointment that seems created just for him, right? Who received these allocations, I wonder? And in the months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, at that, which was on December 7th. So interesting that the board disbands about a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor in January. That's very curious. Right? And so he's also the only chair of the Board of Economic Warfare, right? Which is a 3-year commission for him, right? And he's the only one of those as well. Whose economy was he managing the warfare of? I don't know, but I just couldn't investigate that and expect this episode to ever come out, right? Because it only gets better from here. He's also the 11th Secretary of Agriculture. That's right. He's the Gateway Secretary of Agriculture. The department's agenda changes with and after him. And so if you're into numerology and gematria or whatever, the number 7 is the number of perfection. Then that must mean Henry A. Wallace was the perfect Secretary of Agriculture with his 7-year run. And it's because of this that the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center is named after him. But it doesn't end here, my friends. Oh no, right? Because from 1941 to 1945, so essentially the entire time America is involved in World War II, Henry A. Wallace serves as the 33rd Vice President of the United States. Are you kidding me? We have a Wallace second in command of America during World War II, and he's the 33rd man to hold the position? You don't think he was a member of this club, do you? Of the 33rd degree, perhaps? I don't know, but all of a sudden, it's hard to imagine a more powerful or influential man in American politics at that time than Henry A. Wallace. It's bananas, but not as bananas as finding out that, along with displaying an intellectual curiosity about a wide array of subjects, including statistics and economics, he explores various religious and spiritual movements, including theosophy. Not the 33rd vice president, right? He didn't practice theosophy, did he? And just check out some of these symbols. We got the Om, we got the swastika, we got Ouroboros, we got the Star of David, the Egyptian cross. There is no religion higher than truth. Right? Of course not. What is the truth? It's that there is no religion. It's all made up. It's just crazy. And he obviously dodged a bullet for not being a Nazi sympathizer if his study of theosophy was well known, right? And this symbol was out there. As that's very curious, all this timing and positioning. But the insanity continues because Henry A. Wallace's grandfather, John, was an Ulster Scots immigrant from where? From Londonderry, that's where. Are you kidding me? Surely this is just more of those McKimsidences that Henry's grandfather comes from the same county that our McKims come from, right? There's nothing to see with the McKims' possible connection to William Wallace through the clan Fraser, is there? Right? All circumstantial coincidence, right down to Henry A. being the 33rd Vice President of the United States. But it's his perfect shepherding of the Department of Agriculture that connects him to the Goat Man via the Beltsville Agricultural Center, known primarily as BARC. And Wiki doesn't offer much on BARC, but they do put up a list of the things that they research there. And it's quite impressive, almost staggering, because essentially it's a list of everything important for human existence, right? Look at that one in red. What kind of global change are they researching? And they research bullshit, finally admitting the truth about something. But most interesting to this story is that it researches genomics and genetic improvement. And this is plant and animal husbandry. And that is breeding plants and animals to achieve a certain result. Right? You want a strawberry the size of a softball or a chicken with 2-pound legs? you can order one up, right? And they do all of this research for the USDA, right? So what does it say? That the agency that's put in charge of what we eat is also in charge of plant and animal genomics and genetic improvements. I mean, you know the scientists at Barks are chomping at the bit to make the next Frankenchicken because KFC has jumped on the lab-grown meat bandwagon, right? The fast food giant says it's collaborating with Russian company 3D bioprinting solutions. And I wonder if anybody told KFC that they're not supposed to be dealing with the Russians. And what are the Russians doing with 3D bioprinting solutions? I don't know, right? But they're developed the first lab-created chicken nuggets using 3D printing technology. Right? The process involves employing additive bioprinting technology using chicken cells and plant material, with the final product having the taste and texture of chicken meat. And for its part, KFC will provide the coating and the Colonel's special blend of herbs and spices. And so this article really goes on the offensive with its clean meat agenda, because there certainly appears to be one. If this type of thing is going on at the at the USDA research labs, then that has to be viewed as complementary research to the things they have going on with the Human Genome Project and the great things that they're hoping to achieve. New BioInk brings 3D printing of human organs closer to reality, March 17th. And March 17th is an 11. It says researchers have designed a new BioInk, which allows small human-sized airways to be 3D bioprinted with the help of patient cells. This is really amazing because they're looking to 3D print human organs from cells. And so, it makes me kind of wonder, could the USDA be grading human nuggets? I don't know, but the technology to make human nuggets certainly exists. It's just really unbelievable. Because you know that if a market for human nuggets exists, and you know that in Mud City that market exists, then there are human nuggets out there. It is just crazy. And I originally thought to use this as a springboard to look at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, but I think the story is better served by taking a closer look at its master, the USDA, right, and its origins. It may come as no surprise to you that the USDA official website doesn't really give up much on its history. This is the entirety of its history page. The USDA.gov history page for the United States Department of Agriculture. That's it. Right? And so they're forcing me to go to Wikipedia and the other AI gatekeepers. And so Wikipedia is kind enough to share the story of the Department of Agriculture's origins within the U.S. Patent Office. And so it says that early in its history, the American economy was largely agrarian. And somewhere I saw that roughly half of the American population at this time were farmers. All right? And it says that officials in the federal government had long sought new and improved varieties of seeds, plants, and animals for import into the United States. So this is kind of amazing because how long, had they been seeking these new varieties of seeds, plants, and animals, and what are they really trying to achieve with these new seeds, plants, and animals for import into the United States, right? And so for the time frame, you're looking at that post-war of 1812 era. Really the whole revolutionary era has ended, and now the new era is starting to really kind of take shape. Right? And I think it's interesting that Wiki continues this article by going on about the creation of the Smithsonian Institution when the Smithsonian Institution really did not incorporate agriculture, at least at the time. So kind of curious it goes this way because it then immediately jumps to 1837 and the appointment of Henry Leavitt Ellsworth to the Commissioner of Patents in the State Department. Another Henry we have here, right? And it's him that really begins collecting and distributing these new varieties of seeds and plants to members of Congress and local agricultural societies. In 1839, Congress established the Agricultural Division within the Patent Office and allowed it $1,000, or roughly like 30 grand, which was a tremendous sum of money then, for the collection of agricultural statistics and other agricultural purposes. And it's Ellsworth's interest, right, in the application of chemistry to agriculture that's really worth noting here. And he was called the father of the Department of Agriculture. Of course he was, because it was all his idea. And he is Johnny Appleseed, tossing his seeds around. He literally gets to dictate which types of seeds and crops could be planted and where. And you just know they were giving the best seeds and land and stock to their own families first. Him and his Johnny Appleseed type role in what crops could be planted and where. And so I don't know about you, but not all that long ago, I was naive enough not to have considered all the plant and animal husbandry involved in the staples of the American diet, in our fruits and vegetables and meat. And it's Ellsworth and his future USDA that make the farming industry happen. They created it, right? But it takes about 25 years for the department to go legit, when on May 15th, that's an 11, by the way, right? 1862, Honest Abe establishes the Independent Department of Agriculture, and he calls it the People's Department. And that would be we the people and not you the people, right? The way these things play out. And he appoints agriculturalist Isaac Newton as the first commissioner. Like, Isaac Newton? What? And this Isaac Newton is a Quaker. And he was born to a Quaker family of English descent. His father's name was Isaac too, because of course it was. And his story is right from the playbook. He's a humble farmer down on his luck who finds himself selling some farm equipment to the White House and becoming friendly with the President of the United States, right? Like you do. And the President happens to be Abe Lincoln, because of course, right? And Abe takes a shine to Isaac. And I wonder how the biblical parable of Abraham and Isaac fits in here, because surely it does, right? And surely both men were aware of it, right? The story of God commanding Abraham, founder of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? to sacrifice his son Isaac at the spot that goes on to become Solomon's temple, which of course has Jachin and Boaz, right? The gateway to God. So that's kind of interesting, right? And so they say that this parable, this tale of Abraham and Isaac is in the Bible to shy the Hebrews away from human sacrifice, which is just no bueno, right? That's no bad juju with the human sacrifice, regardless of what Baal and Moloch may tell you, right? And it's a lesson some Jews may have ignored, the way accusations of blood libel plague them, especially the European Jew. And this parable morphs over time into something called the sacrifice of Isaac, connoting both the glory and agony of death on the battlefield, which is interesting because the friendship of Isaac Newton and Abraham Lincoln and Isaac's appointment as first commissioner of the Department of Agriculture coincide with the outbreak of the Civil War. According to the narrative, a lot of people are going to die on the battlefields of America's bloodiest war. Could some of these soldiers have been used as ritual bloodshed, sacrifices to fertilize the soil for the new Department of Agriculture? I don't know, but I can't shake that idea. And Isaac's lack of political experience does raise eyebrows on Capitol Hill. But despite this, he proves more than competent, and it's his attention to regional weather reports that leads to the creation of the National Weather Service. And this is interesting because it shows possible complicity from Alexander Dallas Backey and his Coast Survey. Remember, some 30 years earlier, Alexander and his grandfather, Benny Franks, before him, were very interested in the weather. To see that the National Weather Service owes its existence to Isaac Newton and the Department of Agriculture could possibly connect them to the scientific Lazzaroni and weather modification. Of course, weather modification is nothing new, and it's not just the stuff of bad James Bond villains and science fiction. They tell us they're doing it. They just don't tell us to what extent. National security and all that. They like to tell us that weather modification is something benign like cloud seeding. But could they be unleashing some of these monster tornadoes and other storms? I doubt we'll ever know, but it certainly seems possible. And I touched on this years ago in the Who Owns the Clouds episode. And so the idea of weather modification being linked to the Department of Agriculture is very interesting considering the state of American agriculture today and the crazy storms that the Midwest has had to deal with for what seems like forever. I mean, The Wizard of Oz was published in 1900, programming tornadoes at least that far back. And so learning to control or predict the weather was certainly part of their agenda, because it's clear to me that they've been working towards this goal for a very long time. And I think it's quite possible that most of, if not all, of our weather and the quote-unquote natural disasters of today could be orchestrated events. But I'm digressing here. Let's get back to Isaac Newton and his newly formed USDA. And so the USDA spends the next 25 years or so doing its thing, sending out new seeds and animals out into the frontier with their cherry-picked farmers, when in 1887 they get the Hatch Act pushed through Congress, providing for the federal funding of agricultural research centers in each state. Right? And the Beltsville Research Center is one of these. And it was opened in 1910, some 23 years after the Hatch Act. And I love that it's the Hatch Act that gets these research centers off the ground. It's allegedly named for the politician William Hatch, who introduces the bill. A well-compensated William Hatch, I'm sure. But I love all the different metaphors that can be pulled from this. A hatch is a doorway. This act could be the gateway to the new era of agriculture, the scientific era of agriculture. Eggs hatch, and chickens are a huge part of American agriculture. Reptiles have eggs too, and they hatch. So hello, David Icke and the lizard people, right? But I'm getting too carried away with this, right? This act establishes all these research centers, and Beltsville, as I said, is built in 1910, just in time for the Smith-Lever Act of 1914. The Smith-Lever Act funded cooperative extension services in each state to teach agriculture, home economics, and other subjects to the public. With these and similar provisions, the USDA reached out to every county of every state. What was happening in America in the late 19th and early 20th century that the USDA needed to teach its citizens the basics of agriculture and home economics? Is it a coincidence that the time from the passing of the Hatch Act to the Smith-Lever Act corresponds with the peak of European immigration? Did none of these immigrants know how to farm or manage their households? Or did they just need to learn your way of doing things? And this brings us back to William A. Wallace and the changes he institutes as the perfect 11th United States Secretary of Agriculture, and what happens with the Department of Agriculture under the perfect secretary of FDR's New Deal, right? And that's a story for another time, because none of this would be possible without our Johnny Appleseed, Henry Leavitt Ellsworth. He and his buddies in the government had long sought new and improved varieties of seeds, plants, and animals for import into the United States. And so essentially what they were doing was terraforming the United States. How many Native American plant and animal species were eliminated by these deliberately loosed invasive species? We may never know, right? But it now becomes easier to understand that America was once a very different place. Who knows how much is gone or replaced? This sort of terrestrial terrorism has been going on as long as men have felt free to roam about the realm. And as I mentioned, up to this point, the 1830s, more than half of Americans were farmers responsible for their own agriculture and well-being, raising their own goats or chickens or what have you, growing their familiar fruits and vegetables. But after the populations grew and city life, thanks to all its entertainments and other distractions, was exploding, government needed more food, and it needed men like Henry Leavitt Ellsworth to facilitate these demands. And Henry Leavitt Ellsworth's role as first commissioner of the Patent Office cannot be under or overstated, a position he held for 10 years, from 1835 to 1845. If you invented something and wanted to manufacture or market it, it came across his desk. Think about how lucrative that could have been with a few well-placed private investments. And two early inventions he championed were Samuel Colt's revolver and Samuel Morse's telegraph, making him responsible for who knows how many deaths and social media junkies. And an interesting fact about him, he has a twin brother who was elected mayor of Hartford, a position Henry abandons to become the commissioner of the Patent Office. And his twin, William W. Ellsworth, happens to marry Noah Webster's daughter. Talk about having a close connection to the language of spellcraft, and who knows, maybe these aren't twins, and they're really the same guy, as we've been seeing with the McKims. I don't know, but it's just interesting to speculate about. And another interesting thing about Henry Ellsworth is his time as Andrew Jackson's Commissioner of Indian Tribes in Arkansas and Oklahoma. And according to the narrative, it was his job to broker the peace between the Indian tribes and the growing Manifest Destiny settlements. And this is interesting for two reasons. First, as discussed in the Whitewash episode, there's something not right about the Native American story as they've sold it to us. And so Mud City sees Henry here as someone adding to that or helping to create that mythology. Something reinforced by the second interesting thing, and that's that one of his 3 traveling companions on his mission was none other than Washington Irving, author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. His name came up recently, but I can't remember in which episode now. That's escaping me. But regardless, the idea of creating a history or a mythology for a native people is nothing new. They admit to doing this in Ireland with Yeats and Tolkien, a story I didn't get to in my Poe Chronicles. And this becomes more interesting when you see that Washington Irving also wrote several histories of 15th century Spain or the 1400s that deal with subjects such as Christopher Columbus and the Moors. The Christopher Columbus story is obviously BS, but how much of what we know about the Moors could be bullshit too if it was written by Washington Irving? And he also wrote biographies of his namesake, George Washington, and of Muhammad. I mean, this is really unbelievable. What, there was no blowback? No jihad against Washington Irving for writing a biography of Muhammad? That's just really incredible. Who knows? Maybe there was, and I just didn't read about it yet. But this aspect of this story is really incredible. And so I don't know if it's on this mission that Henry Ellsworth finds his inspiration for planting the Midwest, but it's this work that he starts by sending out seeds as commissioner of the Patents Office that leads to the creation of the Department of Agriculture, and ultimately the Henry A. Wallace Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, which may or may not have unleashed a goat man into this realm. And so let's take a quick look at what they're up to today at the mighty Henry A. Wallace Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. Okay, and so here's their webpage, and right away I noticed the USDA Civil Rights Policy Statement. And I thought to myself, God, do companies really need to post these days? I've looked at a lot of companies during the course of my show, and I don't think I've ever seen one before. And so this one says, at the USDA, we are recommitting ourselves to the values of equity and equal opportunity for each other and those we serve. And so this makes me kind of wonder what happened to their original commitment to these things. I don't know, but let's get back to their research. And so I think it's interesting that the first thing that they list is poultry disease. We've discussed the connection between poultry diseases and human coronavirus in the Winner Winner Chicken Dinner episode. And they also do bee research, which is really unbelievable, considering the part that bees have played in the Mud City paradigm. But I don't really feel the need to dig too deep into their website today. I think we all have a pretty good understanding of the types of things that they're up to at these research facilities, especially with all the plant and animal husbandry. I think maybe the big takeaway here is that we should be paying a little more attention to the Department of Agriculture and their possible complicity in the horrible conditions of today. Everything from weather control to the food shortages to the everyday health of Americans, whom the USDA has failed spectacularly. And so we're going to bring it back to the goat man now before closing this one out. And I doubt that the goat man sprang from the labs of the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. It just seems too convenient in origin, especially with the history and widespread nature of the legend. And the addition of the axe murdering element seems deliberate too, especially the way it seems to predict the coming trend of slasher movies and the like, because not only is the goat man roaming around PG County, the bunny man is too. And Mrs. Fat's friend said she was way more frightened of stories of the bunny man than she ever was of the goat man. But to me, as with most urban legends, there's some element of truth to them. And so Mud City sees the story of the Maryland goat man as a cover-up for the fact that goatmen or satyrs may exist, or existed anyway, in the modern era, because they were venerated by the wealthiest, the most influential people in Baltimore, maybe in the U.S., and perhaps even the whole realm, the way Mud City spins it. And so if one of these creatures occasionally gets too close to Gen Pop, the Men in Black or Fox Mulder or whoever is called in to get the spin machine going, to feed the local papers stories about a goat man, right? Because you can't have Gen Pop looking too closely, or they might find these creatures, right? That wouldn't do, all right? And so those are my thoughts on the Goat Man and the amazing journey my simple curiosity took me. And it's not over, because I have a genetically engineered giant cherry to put on top of this episode to close out this season. And that's when I was reading about PG County, they list 3 sister cities, which I thought was kind of odd. How does a county with 5 or 6 towns in it or whatever have sister cities? And we've talked about the sister city program a few times in the past. And so PG County is either little or big brother to Ziguinchor, Senegal, which is in West Africa here, not all that far from Liberia of the Maryland Colonization Society, so possibly connecting it to the slave trade narrative in some way. And PG County is also siblings with the Royal Bafokeng Nation in South Africa, which is located down here. They didn't have a good highlight for it on Wikipedia. And so the key word with the Royal Bafokeng Nation in South Africa is royal. They trace their kingship back some 15 generations, which may connect all the way back to the Dutch crown, because at one time Bafokeng was a province of the Dutch. And I love that their flag has the shovel and the pitchfork, because the shovel and the pitchfork are on the side of Douglas Thomas's B&O Railroad building of 1906. And it just so happens that the Royal Bafokeng Nation has the world's largest deposits of platinum group metals such as platinum, rhodium, and palladium. making it a tremendously wealthy nation. So it's lucky that PG County is related to Bafokeng, perhaps an inspiration for Marvel's Kingdom of Wakanda of Black Panther. But it's the third sister city that really blew my mind, especially the way it fits in to the rest of the Mud City paradigm. And that third city is Rashan Li Zion. And so Rashan Li Zion is a city in Israel located along the central Israeli coastal plain 8 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. And Rashan Li Zion literally translates as first to Zion. Founded in 1882 by Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire who were part of the first Aliyah, it was the second Jewish farm settlement established in Ottoman Syria in the 19th century. And as of 2017, it was the fourth largest city in Israel. So the first Russian and European Jews started to come over into Palestine some 60 years before the events of World War II would create the shit show that's going on in Palestine today. Because back then, there really didn't seem to be any problems. The first Aliyah was considered a success through the eyes of some historians, since Jews were able to migrate and thrive economically in Palestine. Again, where does that fit in to the narrative that they're spreading today? But it wasn't easy, right? The land of Palestine is terrible for farming. It's dry and rocky. There's no water, right? So the puppet Baron Edmund James de Rothschild takes over and throws a bunch of money and agricultural experts at the problem, and they're able to get a bunch of farms up and running. Rothschild funds an agricultural center and synagogue, and the community thrives. And so the idea of Zionism really starts to pick up steam here. And so it's very interesting that PG County would be paired with Rashan Li Zion, which is an agricultural success story. And PG County has an agricultural research facility promoting the success of agriculture. And is it a coincidence that that research facility is named after Henry A. Wallace, 33rd Vice President of the United States and practitioner of Theosophy? And who knows what this could mean for the future of Mud City, because the event that started my show was finding this building with its exposed lower windows and Star of David. And so now that we have Cathedral Hill all situated, and we know where the Quakers are, maybe it's time to find out where these guys are. I don't know. We'll see. And so to close this season out with a little levity, when I was putting this one together, I discovered that a group of goats is called a tribe. And so now in Mud City, that could mean that the founding fathers of the original tribes of Israel could all be goat men or satyrs. And that would extend to Simeon, of course, who could be the patriarch of the clan Frasers and therefore Armakims. And so that's just a little unbelievable way to end this season. I hope everyone has a great summer. And remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers.